Hello, I'm Elena van Stee, the blog editor for Context Magazine. And this week on the Context blog, we are talking with Michèle Lamont about her new book, Seeing Others. And you can see Michèle is joined here by Shira Zilberstein and Mari Sanchez. They're two PhD candidates at Harvard who worked with Michèle. They conducted all the Gen Z interviews for Michèle's book. And they're also the authors of two published articles that use these interviews to examine how young people coming of age today have been navigating the many crises thrown their way and are challenging traditional scripts of success in the process. So Michèle, Shira, and Mari, welcome to Context.
Thank you for having us.
Well, Michèle, let's start with the book. So for those who are not familiar, can you introduce us to the main argument of Seeing Others?
Yes, the book aims to rectify a lot of the habits that the American public has in thinking about inequality. And I aim to shed light on an aspect of inequality that's often neglected, which is what I call recognition, which is the process by which groups are viewed as worthy or stigmatized. So I aim to explain to non-experts how this happens. It's a process that's going on all the time so that we all have a vocabulary to talk about this. And by recognition, I don't mean I recognize Joe on the street or I recognize that this is an apple, but really I'm talking about seeing people and being able to define them as valuable.
So in sociology, often we're trying to quantify material or legal disparities between groups. Tell us more about how this more subjective concept of recognition and seeing others matters.
Well, I zoom on narratives, the stories we tell about each other and about the world we live in, and how repeated narratives lead to having a consistent understanding of what various groups is about. So I give the example of people with HIV/AIDS who were viewed as extremely stigmatized when the AIDS crisis appeared, and now they're viewed as totally fine. And this didn't happen with people who are obese. They were stigmatized, they're still stigmatized. So I draw on past publication that really explain the kind of alliances that are necessary between knowledge workers, social scientists, journalists, medical and legal experts, and social movement activists for these changes to happen. So that's one example among many. There's also, same-sex marriage, the process by which it became widely diffused and how it diffused groups such as high school students who are LGBTQ, ended up fewer of them doing attempted suicide than it was the case previously. So it's really about how the narratives that people have, through which people are depicted, is influencing their subjective well-being and how much this matters for inequality.
So you've just mentioned a whole wide range of stigmatized groups. I'm curious, for this book, how did you decide who you wanted to talk to?
Well, since I knew I wanted to study narratives, because I decided to write the book during the Trump presidency, and like many people, I was somewhat depressed. So I read on how is hope produced, and I realized it's all about intersubjective definition of reality, how together through human beings we come to zoom on alternatives to our lives. So I decided to focus on change agents, people who are creating new narratives, giving us new lenses through which we can understand our future.
Now, Michèle, this is not your first book. You've spent much of your career helping us understand how different social groups think about moral worth, these ideas you were describing about who has worth and what kinds of lives are worth living. So tell us, how do you see this new book, Seeing Others, building on or maybe in some ways departing from your prior research?
Well, one of the theme that comes back a lot is the importance of having a pluralistic understanding of worth. I contrast, the period of growing inequality that came with neoliberalism with the focus on a script of self that's very narrowly defined. We're supposed to be worthy if we are self-reliant and if we are college educated and make money and engage in consumption. And in the alternate approach is really to have a multiple ways of assessing people's worth, so that caregivers are highly valued and spiritual people. So the idea of, shining under different lights, which was also very central to my book on peer review, How Professors Think, is there. And also my book, The Dignity of Working Man, really emphasized the ways in which workers try to put themselves above the upper middle class by viewing themselves as more moral. And this is also something that is very at the center of the book, to the extent that I do argue that a society where basically only the college-educated professionals are the winners is a society that is extremely unhealthy for everyone. And we really need to think about how to create and scale up different narratives so that more people feel like worthy. That's probably the main argument of the book. And I explain in the last chapters how this can be accomplished, and also how Gen Zs do contribute to this, just as the change agents, the 185 change agents that were interviewed, do as well. So.
I'm thinking of the points where you touch on this in your book, but can you tell us more about the ways in which your own identity or your own life experiences have shaped your thinking about this work?
Yes, well, in the first chapter of the book, the introduction, I say, why would anyone listen to a Harvard professor about social change? And I say, well, I'm not who you think I am. I may be teaching in the building that's actually an ivory tower. It's a big white
Very
building.
literally.
we all have offices in this building. But in fact, I have a very unusual background. I'm a French Canadian. I grew up at the height of the independentist movement that was extremely anti-imperialist toward the US, toward Europe. And I had all kinds of experiences also as a young woman in the 70s. Everyday feminism was my central to my life, trying to change the relationship in my family, where the division of labor between me and my brothers was not exactly equal. And also, I'm an immigrant. People don't think of, when I tell my kids I'm an immigrant, they laugh because they don't think that someone like me is an immigrant, but I'm an immigrant. So it means I've always lived as an outsider in a society where many people would think of me as very much of an insider. But in many ways, I think of myself as an outsider. And I relate to the society in which I live with a certain amount of distance, which I think prepares me to do the kind of book that I wrote. And also I have 3 Gen Zs, so that really has inspired my work as well, of course, wanting to think about what they want and the ways in which they're not necessarily, following the scripts that many parents want their kids to follow. So, and trying to understand, how to help them out.
Well, let's talk about these Gen Zs. Shira and Mari, you've been patiently hanging out in this Zoom call. Shira, let's talk about your article, Recreating a Plausible Future, Combining Cultural Repertoires in Unsettled Times. To start off, I'd love to hear more about the American dream, a concept that you engage in this article. So to what extent does Gen Z believe in the American dream?
So in the article, we were really interested in how young people were thinking about their goals, objectives, and futures when many of the past ideals, a lot of them associated with the American dream, that structured our ideas about success and career paths, especially for college-educated youth, were becoming increasingly unattainable. So this is career paths that are less stable because of economic precarity, and it's more difficult to own a house given changes in the economy, and new narratives like diversity and inclusion that challenge some of our past ideals. And we found that the American dream was still a prominent ideal that structured young people's life goals and how they thought about their paths. So many still believed in the value of hard work and perseverance, individual action being associated with progress, and personal initiative as part of moral worth. But we also saw that they expressed some differences in their interpretation of the American dream than the traditional ideal would suggest. So for example, they criticized a hyper-focus on competition or narrow ideas about socioeconomic success, and instead expressed a diversity of goals that could be part of the American dream, such as being happy or having a balanced life. So while the pathways to reach these goals was still focused a lot on individualism and hard work, which were largely drawn from the original American dream ideal, it mixed with some new goals that young people felt were more achievable given the current economic, social, and political contexts.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell us more about some of the other cultural repertoires, the other narratives that they were pulling together, adding to this American dream?
Yeah, so in the paper, we explain how respondents draw on 3 other main cultural repertoires in combination with the American dream. And there was some evidence of some other repertoires like gender scripts, but we focused on these repertoires because they were the most prominent overall in the sample. The first one was the therapeutic culture, which forefronts ideas about self-care, such as positive thinking, happiness, self-actualization, and personal balance. So this goes along with ideas about wellness culture and the idea of being your best self through individually focused betterment techniques. The second one was this idea of ordinary cosmopolitanisms, which is thought of in terms of an allegiance to a world community of humankind without clear boundaries between an us and a them. So forms of difference are recognized, but they're not hierarchical. And this is expressed in sentiments such as we're all children of God, or we're all made from the same DNA. And lastly, we found a cohort narrative that captured the identity of the young people formulated by and articulated by themselves. So this was informed by messages in the media, marketing, research, and based on the shared experiences of young people growing up together. So the narratives around Gen Z describe them as change makers that embrace social justice, authenticity, and sustainability, and are committed to diversity and inclusion. So we saw this narrative come up in how young people referred to themselves and their peers and used generational labels and archetypes in describing who they were.
Gotcha.
I may add something. We are very critical of the concept of Gen Zs, as are many sociologists, many demographers. We decided to use the label anyway because the generation defines itself as such. So even if, we cannot distinguish what age, the effect of age, period, and cohort, there's an important argument in our field around this. We think that the concept remains very important since it is very much, embraced by this, age group. So, which is basically people born between 97 and, 2012. I mean, it depends where the cutoff is, but just so you know.
Michèle, a follow-up question for you. At least in this self-understanding of Gen Z, what are some of the defining characteristics?
Well, I think I think that Shira just described them very well. I think these themes are really the main ones that we identified, and we also did 2 waves of interviews. We started in the fall of 2019, at the time where, of course, no one knew that the pandemic was coming. And then as the pandemic started in May, we decided we really need to go back, and we were able to re-interview roughly half of the sample. So we were able to see how their perspective had changed with the shortly after the shock of this pandemic beginning, and to see how they were able to redefine their objectives and also become much more politicized. I mean, basically, we were in the middle of the Black Lives Matter movement when we did these interviews. So the great salience of politics that Shira just mentioned was extremely important. And I should mention also that Mary and Shira also analyze all the data. So they are the lead authors for these two papers that came out in sociological science and social science and medicine. And I drew on these papers to write the chapter on Gen Zs in the book. So I want to fully acknowledge their contribution.
Thank you, Michèle.
Both of which are fantastic pieces. We haven't touched on the other article, the COVID-focused one yet. So maybe we can turn to Mari now for a little bit. You're the lead author on this one in social science and medicine. And I'm, of course, particularly interested in this, given my own research on college students navigating COVID. And I'm very excited to talk about this overlap in our work.
Yeah, same.
So starts off, tell us about what inspired the decision to do the second wave of interviews. What were some of the questions that you thought this moment could help you answer?
Yeah. So, as Michelle mentioned, we started the research before the pandemic, and we already knew that today's youth were going through a lot, right? You're entering adult life after decades of growing inequality and this broader breakdown in intergenerational mobility. So it was difficult in general, even at that time, for them to think about how to pursue their education and find, a foot in the labor market and just generally become an autonomous adult, right? So that was sort of our motivation going into the study. We wanted to understand how they were able to develop resilience and protect their well-being in the face of these challenges, even as they're sort of managing uncertainty associated with growing inequality. So we didn't originally anticipate doing the second wave of interviews, but once the pandemic, really began to sort of hit, we realized that this longitudinal data would actually be really useful for us to understand, how youth are sustaining their well-being amidst uncertainty, So knowing that we needed to kind of understand that broader question, we decided to do those wave 2 interviews, which helped us understand responses to conditions of dramatically increased uncertainty, especially associated with, the pandemic, as well as sort of the broader racial reckoning that happened after the 2020 murder of George Floyd and the mobilizations against police violence.
Tell us more about what you mean by resilience. And Michelle and Shira, feel free to jump in here too. I guess I'm curious in particular how in this article your concept of social resilience is different from viewing this as more of an individual personality trait, something like grit.
Yeah, and Michelle, definitely feel free to jump in here because we build on some work that Michelle did with Peter Hall on social resilience. But basically, popular scholarship on resilience has been influenced a lot by psychologists, and they tend to focus on individual traits like grit. So it ends up being this trait that you have more or less of, and it doesn't really look at the possibility that there could be different responses to crisis. As a result of thinking about these different traits and the background in psychology, it tends to focus on cognitive responses, which has the unfortunate consequence of locating social problems in the individual. So instead, we're looking at social resilience as a sort of collective capacity rather than an individual capacity to maintain or improve subjective well-being. And we recognize that a lot of times, the sociocultural resources that people have at their disposal to overcome these crises are actually produced by groups or communities. I think this approach also does a really nice job of thinking about resilience as as a process rather than an outcome, and thinking about subjective experiences of resilience. So, how people understand their context, how they are thinking about how to respond to it, how are they imagining ways of moving ahead in the face of constraints. So that's sort of the general gist of social resilience. Michelle, is there anything you want to add there?
Yeah, the idea is also that we can engineer or create societies that allow for more or less collective resilience. So example of the same-sex marriage laws that I mentioned, they are human-made, and yet they really enable a lot of recognition. The narratives that I study in the book are another example. So instead of thinking some people have grit, others are not, it's more like we can create societies that enable more social resilience. So it's a very big difference in perspective.
And the last thing I wanted to just comment on that is, as Michelle mentioned, there's some really nice literature around social resilience. Definitely take a look at her work with Peter Hall. But our paper is really taking the idea of social resilience and putting it in conversation with literature on time and the role of future projections. So we're really trying to suggest that the idea of being able to maintain or improve this collective subjective well-being depends on actors' perceptions of time. So whether or not they perceive challenges as immediate or distant, their responses as short-term or long-term, and these possible futures that they can pursue as happening in the near or distant future. So we'll find that as you'll see, we find that some actors see their temporal horizons really expanding with new possibilities, while others see them contracting because the crises are just limiting all kinds of opportunities for them.
Can you tell us more about the differences in your sample in terms of how they view these temporal horizons?
Yeah. So we compared 2 class groups, what we call the privileged and the less privileged, to see how they are basically, accessing resources to enable or constrain the development of social resources, and kind of doing that at different temporal scales. I think you'll see that there's a lot of overlap with how you think about and construct your sample in your paper. So the first group is youth from middle or upper class families. They have college educated parents, employed as professionals, managers, or entrepreneurs. In general, this group has a lot of cumulative advantages that help them leverage different kinds of resources to buffer themselves against uncertainty. So, you know, a lot like what you found in your paper, they can turn to their parents for financial support, move back to their parents' home, hire tutors, etc. On the other hand, though, you know, as it relates to resilience, they also experience some unique challenges tied to their position. Anxiety fed by pressures to succeed, or declining mental health due to unachieved expectations. So that's the first group. Our second group, which we call, you know, less privileged, is youth from lower, middle, and working class families. And so we define these as youth with parents with high school degrees who work in low status white or blue collar jobs, or generally comprise single parent households. So they had fewer advantages than our privileged youth in our sample. You know, they're more likely to work in college. They may not have space to study at home, or they have to contribute to paying family bills, again, as you found in your study. And so, of course, the lack of material resources can compound the challenges that they were already facing. But, you know, it also could make different types of tools, cultural tools available to them, which can help them bolster their ability to respond to uncertainty and build their social resilience.
Thanks.
Before we go on, I should probably mention, since the people who are listening to us will not know, that you publish yourself a paper comparing class reactions, class differences in reaction to COVID among college students, which came out in the Journal of Marriage and Family, right? So we have some questions for you on this.
Yes, have at it.
Mary and Shira, would you like to throw in some?
Absolutely. So can you talk a little bit about sort of the, you know, you see that your students are kind of understanding different sources of support that they receive from their families. So can you talk a little bit about how, you know, they ascribe meaning to those sources of support, and also maybe how that differed by class?
Yeah, definitely. So the groups that I'm comparing in this study are very similar in terms of the class divide to the groups that you use. All the students in my study, though, did attend a single university. I was drawing from a single elite university in the Northeast. And most of these students were living on campus or near campus in off-campus housing with roommates when the university shut down in March 2020. And so I looked at their housing decisions. I found that this was a really useful lens for seeing how they understood their parents' roles in their lives and parental support in general. And so I think what was striking to me initially, really how I got my story and knew what I wanted to study, was that I saw such striking class divides in whether or not it was even a decision to move home, whether these students saw parents' housing support as a source of support. And what I saw initially was that for the more privileged students, really going home was seen as the natural course of action. They when I asked them about how they decided where to go when the university shut down, they were often kind of confused. And they were, what do you mean? Of course I went home. And it's true that for these families, often the kind of economic equation between parents and children wasn't really changed all that much. These parents were typically paying for tuition, room and board, sometimes for living expenses as well, before students moved home. And so in these families, the students didn't usually indicate that they felt like they were really gaining extra from their parents. They were more aware of, I guess, the guidance that their parents were providing in terms of academic decisions, travel, how to stay safe from COVID, and actually really leaned into their parents' roles as a source of guidance. I think probably more so than they had previously and are now in times of less acute crisis. So that's the more privileged side of things. But then for the other half of the sample, these two are young adults who come from families where neither parent has a college degree and are working in low-level manual labor or service sector jobs, many of which were heavily impacted, of course, by the pandemic. Here, they really felt like they were making a decision about where to live. They saw their parents' housing support as a form of support that they were not taking for granted. And in many cases, we're very concerned about exposing their parents to the virus, about being a burden to their parents. And so many of them went home. Also, many of them did not, found other places to live. But the common thread was that they were thinking about that. They felt like it was a decision, and they really felt like it was their decision. That was what stuck out to me.
And as Mari mentioned, in our research, we focused a lot on temporality, both in terms of the unfolding of crisis in time and the imaginations of futures as part of cultural change and resilience. So I'm wondering if temporal trends came up in your research at all, especially in how students, maybe past associations with different domestic or educational experiences, shaped how they understood those resources to be protective or vulnerable in the current crisis.
Yes, definitely. A concept that stuck out to me from your article and really shaped my own thinking about this was the idea of the origin of the crisis. And I was struck by how for many of the less privileged students, this wasn't their first crisis. And it wasn't the first time they had seen their parents shaken. And I found that these students saw their parents and their homes as being much more vulnerable to external shocks than the privileged students. And I think this really shaped the way that they thought about home and about going home and about whether their parents were at risk of COVID. For the more privileged students, home seemed to have this kind of mystical safe haven image for them. It was like they could go home, their parents would tell them what to do, they could stay safe. And this was not something that the less privileged students described. Home was not a shelter from the troubles of the world. They had been dealing with a lot of troubles this whole time.
If I may throw in another one, young adulthood is also a period in developmental terms where people try to define their identity in part against their parents, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's a moment where there's a lot of push and pull and, people defining their personal boundaries. So I find it interesting that you didn't see that much conflict between parents and children in the more privileged sample that you looked at. So you mentioned maybe them turning more toward their parents for advice. Maybe you can expand a little bit on the conditions that made this possible. And also your argument is very much about the role of cultural understanding as scripts, if you will, that are shared among the people you've interviewed. So maybe you can expand a little bit on how you understand the place of cultural understanding in your analysis.
Definitely. To touch on the first point, I think there was a huge time element to it. So I started interviewing in June, I believe it was, so a similar time to you, and continued throughout that fall and early into the next winter. And I saw a huge change in the extent to which these young adults wanted their parents to be in charge. Yes. And yeah, it would be interesting to do a more systematic comparison between, I'd say, the spring housing decisions and the fall housing decisions, because in the spring, I can think of a couple of specific students where I had talked to them maybe in September, October, and so they could tell me about both housing decisions. And often it was the case that in the spring, in March, they wanted to go home. There were a couple of exceptions to that, but most of them who went home wanted to go home. But by the fall, then families were having conversations about, oh, okay, school is still remote, but maybe you could live in an off-campus apartment so that you can hang out with your friends. And here there was a lot of tension between parents and young adults as time progressed, as kind of the acuteness of the crisis seemed to wane. And as these people had been living, seeing only each other for months on end, that was when the conflict started to emerge there. So you make a good point. It depends on whether you're asking in March or in November, in large part. Mm-hmm. And as for the second point about, why study these cultural understandings? I think especially during the early months of this research, I often felt like the material inequalities between these families are so huge. Why am I thinking about how they think about their relationship with their parents? Because the more obvious and more important in many respects difference here seems to be like, okay, you can pay the bills and this family can't pay their bills right now. As I thought about this more, I think what we gain from thinking about these cultural understandings of parents' roles and of dependence or autonomy is that we might take it for granted that if parents have resources, then they're going to pass them on to their children, and children are these passive recipients of parents' resources. But I really want to question that assumption, because in reality, in order for the privileged students in my study to benefit from their parents' resources, a couple of conditions had to be in place. And so parents had to have the resources, but also the parents had to think that it was their role to give them, to give advice, to give money, to have the child come back home, and the young adults too. I mean, they could have found another place to live. And for the working class students, that seemed like an option. They just had different like realms of mental possibilities that they were considering. And so it's this assumption of prolonged dependence, especially in a time of acute crisis like this, that was what enabled this transmission of the parents' resources. But you might ask, what happens when it's not a global pandemic and maybe when the kid is 28 instead of 22? And that's what I'm looking at with my dissertation right now, which is a story for another day. But as it turns out, there are more cases where these resources, the guidance, the money, etc., is not being transferred so seamlessly.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Great topic.
All right, well, we have been chatting for a while. I think to wrap up, I want to return to the book for a little bit. So here at Context, of course, we have this goal of making sociology accessible to non-sociologists. And Michèle, for this book, you've decided to publish with a trade press. I would love to hear more about your thinking behind that and kind of who you envision as the audience for your book.
Well, having written books that were really oriented toward my peers or other academics, my previous book had been How Professors Think, and book on racism. I really wanted to have an impact on non-academics. So deciding to first get an agent to convince me that I could do this, although I had my doubts, and then her doing an auction, which, really really raised the stakes in terms of what I was going to do. It was a very humbling position to be in, because I was put back in the position of a graduate student where people were really correcting my writing in a very concrete manner. I had to learn to write differently and rewrite the book. So it took longer than I would. And then this summer, for the last few months, normally I really use my summer to be intensely involved in research. But this summer it's been, podcast and, trying to write op-ed, learning to write op-ed, which is quite difficult. And of course, learning how much determination it takes, because op-eds get turned down. You have to submit a lot to get one in. So, I will see at the end of the day whether it was a great idea, but so far I've learned a lot. I really wanted to challenge myself. I was president of the American Sociological Association in 2016, the year that Trump was elected. And I felt like, okay, now I need a new challenge, where that was going to be my new challenge. And I really enjoyed learning a lot, but we will see how I feel in a year from now. In any case, it's been a great experience so far.
Fantastic. And while the book may appeal to non-sociologists, I imagine many people in the audience right now are sociologists. We are all sociologists. And so what is your message to sociologists? What do you hope we all take away from it?
Well, I hope people read the footnotes because there's a lot of them. And I think although the writing is very, accessible, there's just an enormous amount of research that went into the book. Every sentence is backed up, and there's no footnote per se. They have trailing footnotes where you basically have to find, a line, a few words, and find them on the page. It's not that convenient, but that's how they do it at Simon & Schuster. So I think really the book was inspired by a sociological dilemma, which is that the literature on inequality does not look at cultural processes that much. And I really build on a number of articles I wrote with graduate students and other collaborators over recent years. To really try to set an intellectual agenda for the field as well in the study of culture and inequality. So people who've read my previous books know what this is about, but I think that this book really moves it, forward in very in new ways. So I hope that I really hope the colleagues will really engage. And I plan to give a number of talks in the US and in Canada and Europe to colleagues at the same time as the book is being launched to a wider audience. So I think that the book will have two lives simultaneously. I'm not at all ready to give up on, having conversations with my colleagues about what difference the book makes in terms of how we conceptualize inequality. So we will see.
Well, thank you. We're all very excited to read it.
Thank you so much.
And thanks for joining the blog. Bye, all.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Elena.
Thank you, Elena.
Take care.